part of our webinar series, Community Conversations on Poverty, Lessons Learned During COVID-19, co-hosted by the Division of Social Accountability and the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. The Division of Social Accountability in the College of Medicine is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis in Saskatoon. And the College of Medicine works and partners with communities, clinical faculty, and has students learning on Treaty 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10 territories. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We acknowledge Indigenous peoples as ongoing and current stewards of this land. My name is Erin Wolfson, and I am the Community Engagement Specialist in the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. If you've attended one of our last few conversations in this series, then you'll know that throughout the fall, we are coming together with the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership, or SPRP, to discuss lessons learned during COVID-19, how these intersect with the 12 bold ideas to eliminate poverty, and how to move forward. If you're not familiar, the 12 bold ideas to eliminate poverty is a strategy of 12 intersectoral and interconnected ideas that, if implemented, could have significant impact towards eliminating poverty in Saskatoon. For today's conversation, we recognize the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, which falls each year on the 17th of October, which is tomorrow. And declared by the United Nations in 1992, this date provides a shared moment each year across Saskatchewan, Canada, and around the world to reignite our commitment to end poverty in our communities, to acknowledge the effort, expertise, stories, and experiences of people living in poverty, and to recommit to coming together to ensure the right to live free from poverty is respected. As described in the 12 bold ideas, poverty shouldn't exist in a country like Canada, one of the richest countries in the world. In a country with such tremendous social investments, people should not be struggling to make ends meet. So, as many argue, poverty is a violation of human rights. And finally, as Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, shared in his message to mark this day, the COVID-19 pandemic represents a double crisis for many already living in poverty. And recent estimates show that the pandemic could push up to 150 million people into poverty this year around the globe. He issued a call for solidarity, not just throughout the pandemic, but beyond. I'm just trying to see, is Colleen joined us yet? Okay. Well, I'm going to just mention.
Sorry, she's just about to join. So
okay. I'm just going to introduce, she's not here yet, but just to mention that my co-host for this series, Colleen Christopherson Cote, who is the coordinator of the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership. And Colleen, I'm sure, will share a few words throughout this presentation. I just also want to welcome those joining us as part of the Public Health and Preventative Medicine Residency Program and the Journal Club that's typically held at this time. Thanks so much for joining us. And finally, before I hand over the virtual mic to our conversation host today, I'd like to just quickly acknowledge my colleague, Anna Winnichak, and our IT support, Tyler, who, as always, provides such needed administrative support. So thanks so much. Please do use the chat function to share any questions or comments that come up for you throughout the presentation. And if you're not familiar with WebEx, or if you prefer to email any questions, please drop us an email, social.accountability@usas.ca, and I'll put that email in the chat. So now I'd just like to introduce our guests and hosts for today's conversation about the official poverty line, the market basket measure. Dr. Chuck Plant is the Houston Family Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. He is co-author of Combating Poverty, Quebec's Pursuit of a Distinctive Welfare State, and several articles and reports documenting poverty, low income, and their effects in Saskatchewan and Canada. Thanks so much for being here, Chuck. And Dr. Sugandhi Del Canto recently completed her PhD at the University of Saskatchewan's Department of Community Health and Epidemiology, and has published on topics such as fruit and vegetable access in Saskatoon and predatory food retail real estate practices. She currently serves on the board of the City Centre Food Cooperative, a local initiative to provide affordable fresh food to Saskatoon's downtown and surrounding areas. And she also knits a lot. Thank you both so much for being here with us today, and I'm going to hand it over to Chuck to get us started.
I think Colleen's here now. Was there anything that we wanted Colleen to add as sort of introductory remarks, or Colleen?
Sorry. No, I think I'm good. I just had some WebEx technical difficulties getting in, so sorry I'm a little bit late. I know we all know how we feel about WebEx, so you can take it over, Chuck, and I apologize again for being a bit late.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm not sharing my screen right now, right? Can you guys walk? I'm just gonna try to reshare. We had it working previously. Now I'm sharing my screen. Can anybody maybe just unmute for a second just to let me know?
You're good.
That's good. Awesome. All right. Thanks for that introduction, Erin. Thanks for having me, everyone. It's always a pleasure presenting with this group. I think I spoke to either this group or a previous incarnation of it a few years back. I'm going to talk about the poverty line that Canada's new kind of, it's less and less new, but especially in academic time scales, it's quite a new development that Canada has an official poverty measure. I'm going to talk a little bit about how it works and it. I'm going to try to move through it fairly quickly. I gave a workshop on this that was a couple of hours long back in February, so I think I saw a couple names on there that were also at that event. So there's going to be a little bit of overlap, or quite a bit actually. That said, there have been some recent developments. Most notably, when I presented back in February, StatCan hadn't quite yet announced their new basing of the poverty measure. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those changes. So hopefully they'll provide some new information, and otherwise it'll just be a refresher. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit about measurement. I'm happy to talk in the discussion about some of the implications and stuff, and talk more generally about poverty themes. But I hope it's useful for. I hope everybody who's here is interested in maybe learning some of the nuts and bolts behind how we measure poverty in Canada. So as I mentioned, we've got this new poverty measure, and the sort of official announcement of this new poverty measure, this new official poverty measure, came with the release of Canada's first poverty reduction strategy in 2018, first federal poverty reduction strategy. Up to a couple of years ago, most of the provinces, if not all the provinces, except Alberta maybe, had released a poverty reduction strategy. But there was still this gap at the federal level. And so in 2018, the previous 2 years have been quite a bit of consultation, and this document came out. And for me, from a researcher's perspective and a quantitative researcher's perspective, it was very interesting to see the government pick a particular indicator to measure poverty in Canada. And that was partly motivated by the fact that the poverty reduction strategy stipulated that its goal was to reduce poverty by 20% by 2020 and 50% by 2030. And so they had to say how they were going to measure that. Prior to 2018, Canada actually had we still actually have three what we call low-income measures, or what Statistics Canada calls low-income measures, that are often used as poverty measures in different contexts throughout the country. And for all the years that I've been working in this space, it was very confusing. And sometimes you sort of end up talking in circles quite a bit, because no one of these three was really the one that everybody agreed we were going to use. These were the LIM, the MBM, and the LICO. Some of you may be already familiar with one or all of these. And so in 2018, the new official poverty measure selected the market basket measure to be its new measure. So you'll sometimes hear, and it's funny because the title of this presentation is Understanding the Poverty Line and the Market Basket Measure. But the poverty line is the market basket measure, so it's a little bit of a little bit misleading. So we'll use the term poverty line or poverty measure and market basket measure sort of interchangeably throughout this presentation. This isn't a trivial choice. Depending on which indicator we choose, we get different levels of poverty. And I'll talk a little bit, this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the details behind the market basket measure. And so provide a little bit of context to how these levels, how these lines actually end up emerging from information about Canadians and their income. But you see, if we use the LIM, poverty tends to be higher. That's the orange line. If you use the LICO, poverty tends to be found to be lower in Canada. Actually, this is Saskatchewan. This figure is for Saskatchewan. And I'll talk a little bit about how the MBM is actually rebased periodically. And so you'll see that with the rebasing in 2018, we actually saw poverty, or like sort of official reported poverty numbers jump, not from year to year, but retrospectively in years that we had already calculated poverty using the older version of MBM. Now we're reporting a higher level for those years because of the change in the indicator. Poverty measurement is useful for tracking poverty at the aggregate level, at the population level, evaluating, progress, social policy progress, economic progress in terms of whether or not people are benefiting from economic growth, or whether social policies are reaching who they need to reach. But there's also a trend there, a development that I've been following with quite a bit of interest in recent years. Has to do with developments in primary care and on the health side around recognizing that income is a critical determinant of health, and actually trying to bring discussion of income and the promise of potentially treating people with income. One doctor in Toronto who's received a lot of, who's really kind of led the way with this is a fellow named Gary Block. You'll see, if you Google his name and key terms like prescribing income, you see this sort of this emergent conversation about the idea that people need a certain amount of income to be healthy, and that if we want to make people healthy or support people's health, it might mean actually providing them with income. And so that conversation is particularly interesting to me. I think it relates to the poverty measure, because I think we're at a point right now in that conversation where there's sort of a mounting awareness of the role of income in health and the promise of treating health with income, but less conversation about what level that needs to be. How much income do people need, right? If you just give somebody $1, you're probably not going to affect them very much. What about 10,000? What about 20,000? Where do we set the line? And so I think these conversations about poverty lines actually relate to that wider conversation, or that sort of more specialized health conversation that I think is really interesting. I think I've already touched on a few of these pros and cons about, there's benefits and negatives to having an official poverty measure. The downside is that no poverty measure is going to be perfect, and so we're always going to be fudging things a little bit. And so some might say having more measures might make that, us less likely to make that mistake. But on the side, I have to say, since the identification of the measure, it's really clarified the conversation. It's provided us with one standard to discuss and improve. In the past, when you were talking about trying to improve any given measure, it was really difficult to get much interest because there was always another measure to talk about. And more generally, I think, based on the consultations that I've been involved in with Statistics Canada around the new measure, there's a lot of research that can happen around it now. And in places where we don't have data, there's a lot more pressure to collect data because of the focus of the conversation. So it shouldn't be done without caution, but in my opinion, there's been some real movement because of the identification of the official poverty measure. I'm going to talk now a little bit more specifically about the market measure and what makes it unique. Essentially, the market measure is defined as a specific basket of goods and services that allows a family to meet its basic needs and achieve a modest standard of living in its community. Essentially, the basket is the sum of 5 categories of items and the cost of what's sufficient to meet that basic standard. And those 5 baskets are food, shelter, transportation, clothing, and an other category that kind of is a grab bag of everything else that people need to survive or meet their basic needs that aren't captured by the other 4 categories. One of the things that really sets the market basket measure apart from the other poverty measures that we've used in Canada is that it is actually defined for every, each of, I believe, I'm forgetting the number, I think it's 42 different economic regions or communities throughout the country. And so in Saskatchewan, for example, we have a market basket measure specifically for Saskatoon. Regina has their own. Then we also have market basket measures for communities of different sizes. So And this figure sort of shows that distribution. There's actually quite a bit of range in the level of the market basket measure across the country. As you might expect, the majority of the market basket measure cost is taken up by shelter, followed by the other and food categories. As I previously, I'm not going to get, in this presentation, I'm not going to talk in detail about how it's calculated for each of those categories. I just want to give you guys a sense. We can, if you guys have specific questions about categories, I'm happy to get into it later. I mentioned already one of the really interesting features of the market basket measure. I mentioned that it updates. It's been updated recently this year, every 10 years roughly. They do Statistics Canada does a series of consultations about how it's calculating those baskets, what it's putting in those baskets, and it adjusts that. And so recently they adjusted the market basket measure upward quite a bit, resulting in an increase in poverty that I was showing earlier. In that sense, it's different from other poverty measures in the sense that it's a living indicator. And I find that really exciting from a research perspective, but also a community-based and participatory research perspective, because we have these conversations about the market basket measure, and if our thinking changes about the market basket measure, there's going to be an opportunity in the future to advocate for changes to the market basket measure, and that's built into the concept of the measure. The market basket measure is generally favored because it's seen as a sort of straightforward measure to grasp. It refers to a specific basket of goods and services. On the other hand, from a data and an analysis perspective and calculation perspective, when you start actually naming baskets and trying to calculate the costs of particular commodities or services, and you want to do that for 42 economic regions across the country, it doesn't, from a computational and from a calculation and from a detailed understanding perspective, the market basket measure is a very complicated measure. So it's easy to grasp. It's like easy to grasp, but difficult to really understand. It's an interesting kind of paradox that it presents. So I previously mentioned that the market basket measure sort of is built around this cost of 5 categories of commodities. But there's a couple of other key features that I want to leave you with that also affect how we use the market basket measure and how we calculate and to actually determine whether a family is poor based on it. In addition to calculating the cost, when we actually are calculating whether, or when I'm doing data analysis and I'm looking at a population, I'm trying to determine whether an individual or household is poor or not based on the market basket measure. Obviously, I have to have this basket threshold, and I'll show you guys what the threshold actually is for Saskatoon in a second here. But I also have to calculate what people's income is. And for the market basket measure, there's a special way of doing that. It's called MBM disposable income. The other thing that happens is the threshold is actually only defined for one family size, and then there's sort of an adjustment that's done to factor in other or account for other family sizes. And so more generally, you can think of the market basket measure as actually bringing these 3 pieces together. The market basket measure is actually defined for a family of 4 with 2 parents and 2 kids, and the kids are 9 years old and 13 years old. And so when they're trying to figure out what that basket is for each area of commodities, they're not asking what that basket costs for every different type of family. They're only asking it for this very generic modal MBM family is what they call it. Okay. When we want to apply that to families that are bigger or smaller, there is some scaling that's done, and you'll actually so here you actually see the new 2018 market basket threshold for a family of 4 in Saskatoon is $45,652. That's indicated by the red line. Based on the math that we use to scale that for other size families, for a 1-person household or 1-person family, the threshold in 2018 is $22,826. The adjustment of that threshold does not factor into any other aspects or needs of the family. And so that's something to keep in mind when we work with the measure. The piece that I mentioned is the disposable income. A lot of people miss this when they're working with the market basket measure. When we talk about our income and how much we make in Canada, we often think about it in terms of our pre-tax income. we usually don't subtract how much we pay in taxes when we tell somebody how much we earn in a year. And there's a bunch of other things that are subtracted from the market basket, from total income when we calculate and determine whether a household is poor using the official market basket methodology. And so this slide just shows sort of a grab bag of some of the things that are in there. The things that are in there because we have it in data. I know in community conversations that we've had, like in my workshop, there's definitely expenses that we would not consider to be, that most of us would recognize as non-discretionary expenses that Statistics Canada or the government just doesn't have good data on, and so aren't factored into market basket measure calculations. As previously mentioned, the 2008 base has made a number of changes. The major change, I think, was to the shelter component, which now reflects the Canadian National Occupancy Standard. I can talk a little bit more later about, if people are interested, in why that's such a big change, why it has such a huge impact. I think it was a change for the better in terms of, I think it more accurately reflects actual costs of shelter in Canada, but I also think it was a change for the better on like a conceptual level. I think it more directly captures poverty, or what I think of when I think of poverty, and what I think most people think of when they think of poverty. And so I'm happy to talk about it. There's been a few other changes around how they calculate transportation habits. They brought having a cell phone into the other basket, being able to afford a cell phone. That wasn't previously taken into account because we didn't used to have cell phones when they first figured it out, 10, 15 years ago. And the clothing basket has been updated again to reflect more modern clothing purchase habits. Yeah, so just a few things, a few takeaways. Some of these I talked about in more or less detail in this presentation. When we're working with the market basket measure, some of the limitations. First off, it considers 5 baskets. Not everything is included. So yeah, we might want to talk about that later. Not everything's included. Another point that I didn't explain at length in this conversation, but the different baskets, the way they're calculated, if you think of them as 5 different poverty measures, they're not all arrived at by the same process. They kind of actually measure different standards of poverty. It's a more academic point, but I like to make it. Another key point actually that I didn't really emphasize is that the market basket measure is defined at the household or family level, and so it's actually the after-tax income, or sorry, it's the market basket disposable income of the entire household unit. It doesn't, if somebody lives with other people and those other people earn income, it doesn't make sense to ask them to determine what their individual poverty status is according to the MBM, without factoring into, taking into account the rest of the household. I already mentioned the issue about family size adjustments. Because of those adjustments and how they work, it's particularly tricky when you apply the MBM either to really small households or families of like 1 person, or to very large families, because the math, the fudges extra the further you get away from a family of 4. And that last point that I really try to emphasize, and I can talk about more later if people are interested, is that non-discretionary expenses from total income. I actually think that that's actually where there's an opportunity there for a lot of discretion on the part of local service providers or health providers or people that are trying to work with the market basket measure in service or client contexts, in terms of thinking about, what is somebody's actual disposable income when we start thinking about whether they can afford before we start thinking about whether they can afford those 5 baskets. So I'll leave it there. Of course, I'm happy to discuss. I've moved through things quite quickly. I'm happy to discuss all these topics in a bit more detail once we transition over to the discussion. But it is now. I'd now like to hand over the mic to Sugandhi. Sugandhi. I will mute.
Hello, everyone. I am going to work on the assumption you can hear me unless someone says otherwise. Chuck, can you nod? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, brilliant. So thank you, everyone. And I know that right now I'm like blown up big on your screen, which is always slightly intimidating. So hello, Internet. Thank you, Erin and Joanna, for this invitation. Thank you to my lovely co-host, Chuck and Colleen, aka C Squared. I would like to acknowledge my gratitude for living on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, and where I've had the privilege to live, learn, and love. I am a second-generation immigrant. My ancestors are from Sri Lanka, Portugal, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. Thank you, colonization. And I will be speaking today briefly on two topics, kind of building on what Chuck had talked about. So my own PhD research was around the experiences of the retail food environment in Saskatoon, specifically from the perspective of mothers with adolescent children. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the food component of the market basket measure and some of sort of the bigger picture issues related to that. And then I also have worked for a long time in HIV related work. So I used to work at the Saskatchewan HIV/AIDS research endeavor, known as SHARE. I was the research director there. And I currently work as a policy analyst at the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network. So I will also speak a teeny tiny bit around HIV as a health determinant, very much connected to poverty as a bigger issue. And that sort of ties in to Chuck's earlier comment of poverty as a health issue. And then even though I can't see your faces, I know that you guys are very knowledgeable on this topic, and I'm not going to say anything earth-shattering, but what I do hope is to hold some space for these kinds of discussions. I won't take very long in my presentation, so hopefully there's enough time after this to discuss any of this further. Normally I would pause here for questions, but I can't see your faces, so I'm just going to barrel through. So I had interviewed 27 mothers of adolescent children in Saskatoon. And I asked them, and they were high income, low income, and medium income parents living in neighborhoods of diverse socioeconomic status. So what does that mean? That means they lived in neighborhoods where the average income was low or the average home ownership was low, and or they had household incomes that were high, medium, or low. And regardless of income, there were a few issues that all of them shared. And there's the term, and I'm not crazy about the term, but it's what shows up in most research, is the term time poverty, which meant that regardless of someone's material assets, an issue that they also faced in terms of food, right, was time. So time to cook, time to go shopping, and all of these things. And as your income went up, you were able to trade off time for the money you could spend. So for example, you could, if you had the money to just go to one place, buy what you need, then you were able to trade off time for income. Whereas if you had less disposable income, you needed to shop around to find the cheapest place to get food, right? And then when you factor in something like public transit versus someone who has a car, right? Someone who has a car can go to whichever store they need, whether that's one or multiple stores, pick up what they need, boom, they're done. Someone using public transit has to wait for the bus, travel through the bus, right? And it has multiple stops along the way. Then you do your shopping, and then you have to wait for, and then you have to do it all in the reverse. So someone by car might be able to finish their grocery shopping in like 20 minutes. Whereas someone using public transit may need to spend up to an hour when you factor in the travel to and from the food store location. So when I think about the market basket measures, when I think about how all these things interconnect, there are all these other elements that they get talked about in research. They're talked about, you know, in spaces like this, but I guess my role here is just to sort of make that a little bit more explicit, is some of these interconnections between the different aspects of the market basket measure. And the ones that I'm speaking to right now are between food and transportation. So I mean, using myself as an example, I moved to Saskatoon 10 years ago, originally from Toronto. I always say that kind of with my head held low in Saskatoon. And so when I was moving here, what I wasn't prepared for was the high cost of living. I was coming from Toronto, and I assumed Toronto, you know, it's expensive. Anything else had to be much more affordable. And I was surprised at the high cost of food in Saskatoon. 10 years ago, I was a slightly different person. So I was also surprised at the high cost of alcohol in Saskatoon. And I was also unprepared for the difference in public transit. So I live downtown. I don't have a car. And as you guys all know, or as most of you probably know, there isn't a grocery store downtown. There hasn't been for at least 5 years. And even when there was one, it was sort of a hit or miss. So there is no full service grocery store downtown. Downtown is also home to many students, many low-income families, and many seniors with mobility issues. So these are all groups of people who will rely on public transit or will need extra considerations in terms of accessing food, especially when there isn't a food store available to you. So when we think about market basket measures, when we think about all the different sort of material aspects that are needed, the income aspects, there is also these things like time, right? And we need to think a lot about that when we think about what makes something affordable, right? Because it's not just the dollars of it, it's how much time did I need to spend to get there? Or how much time do I need to spend cooking? And this is a slight tangent, but it is very much related, is in terms of, so I interviewed mothers of adolescent children, as I mentioned, and it's no surprise to anyone on here, right? We place a lot of pressure on mothers to be good parents. And it's not to say that fathers don't experience that too, but as a society, we put a lot of pressure on women in general, mothers in particular. And when we think about what constitutes good motherhood, right? It's feeding your family or providing food for your family that's healthy, that's nutritious. You know, there's always this ideal of you cook from scratch and all of these things. And that's time, right? That is a time measure. You need time available to you to do these sorts of things. You're working all the time. You don't have that time. And then as well as a society, we judge parents, women in particular, around the kinds of foods that they feed their families, right? So oftentimes low income families, if they have picky eaters, they will need to buy food that they know their kids will eat. Parents in higher income families have more disposable income to get their kids to like kale. I'll use kale as an example, right? And you know, there's that thing, there's in the interviews that I did, I often heard this line of thinking of, you know, if they don't like it the first time, you try and introduce it 3 more times, and then eventually the kid develops a taste for it, which is great if you can afford to buy food that won't get eaten, right? In the hopes that by that 4th time, they will eat it. But when every dollar is so tightly accounted for, you don't have money to buy kale in the hopes that your kids will like it, and then it gets wasted, and now your kids are hungry. So that's why, according to the women I interviewed, there is a lot of reliance on prepared foods, a lot of reliance on foods that we might consider unhealthy, right? But it's because it gets eaten, and it's because it's money that doesn't go to waste. And the reason I bring all that up is, again, around this idea of the pressure that we put on women, mothers in particular. So they've got these pressures around time, they've got these pressures around performance of good motherhood, and all of that, it needs to be tied up in these conversations about poverty, right? It's, again, there's the market basket measures, there's this excellent work happening by Chuck and others around looking at the different ways we measure, we quantify, we describe poverty. But embedded within all of that are also these social aspects, right? And these long-term effects of the expectations we have of mothers. Again, I use mothers in particular because that's a community I've spent some time with. I'm not a mother myself. I should disclose that. I just have so much respect. It is so hard, which is why I wanted to understand their experiences. And then the other aspect I want to talk about briefly is when we talk about poverty as a determinant of health. So in Saskatchewan, I know I'm probably telling a group of people who are very familiar with this, Saskatchewan has the highest rate of HIV in Canada, right? And in some places in particular, like Prince Albert, it's off the charts. And overall as a province, we have a very high rate. And then within certain spots within the province, they're sort of known as hotspots. And if you don't remember anything else that I say today, I do want you to remember that HIV persists where inequity thrives. And inequity is poverty, right? When we think about what are risk factors for HIV, we think of risk factors, you think of something like sharing injection of drug equipment or unprotected penetration, which is a risk, which is a transmission route, but it's not the risk factor, right? The risk factor is poverty. And that's where, as a society, as researchers, as health promotion, all of that stuff, that's where we need to really think about the risk factors for HIV, right? We can, harm reduction is absolutely important. Shout out to Prairie Harm Reduction for opening the province's first safe consumption site. And it's really great to see stuff like that happen because it's more now in the public consciousness, right? And now we need to think bigger. And, again, infinite respect to the hardworking team of Prairie Harm Reduction and all of the allied stakeholders that work with them. And now, as a broader society, we need to think around what is the role or what is the link between poverty and HIV, right? We need to move past this sort of mentality of it's an addictions issue, and definitely need to move past this issue of it's an Indigenous issue. Being Indigenous is not a risk factor, right? The risk factor is poverty, it's inequity, and it's all these other social determinants of health that create the conditions that lead to events that will create the transmission. I will leave it there, because otherwise I just start talking in circles. Those are kind of the two big things I wanted to talk about, was the link between market basket measures and the interconnection of these different measures, and specifically looking at food and transportation, as well as poverty as a health indicator, and specifically poverty as it relates to HIV transmission. So thank you. I will put myself back on mute and turn it over to whomever needs to go next. Colleen, is that you that goes next? And if it isn't, could it be?
I don't know if it's actually me who goes next. I don't know if I was going to spend any time really talking. I think today we wanted to touch base around why the 12 Bold Ideas is rooted in the market basket measure work, and why the official poverty line for Canada is a critical piece to the work to understand sort of where we are in Saskatoon and in this province, and how we're situated in the national framework. And really over the last, it feels like 3,000 COVID years, what do we know now that COVID and the response to COVID, what has been illuminated around those inequities that many of us knew existed pre-COVID, but now there's a sense of urgency around those pieces. And so, how do we look at the baskets of goods that are allocated to define the poverty line? And what are the pieces that we learned over this COVID response that either exasperate those baskets of goods or actually make them a little bit easier to manage? Because some of the responses did look at very specifically, like free transit, for example. Like how does that impact the market basket, and why did we do it as a COVID response, and why can't we do it as an urgent public health response to poverty or homelessness? Those kind of things. So I'll just plant those sort of pondering questions with the participants and open it up for people to ask questions or move the dialogue.
So I think we're going to do questions in the chat. Erin sent me a few questions in advance that people had sent to her. So I'm just going to sort of pick one of those right off the get-go, which is what poverty elimination strategies have been implemented that seem to be working effectively. So we haven't seen a lot, there's probably been two major things in my mind that have happened in the policy space around poverty in Canada. Now being mindful that often when I talk about poverty, I think about it very much at a population level. So there are small groups of people, subpopulations, for whom various policy interventions have an enormous impact on their lives. But for me, when I'm talking about poverty, oftentimes, and in this context right now, I'm thinking about that number that was in one of those figures where it sort of showed that the poverty rate for Saskatchewan is 12%, and developments in that number. So in order for something to have that kind of impact, it has to be like a pronounced event. It has to be something that has widespread impact. In 1% of the population is, I believe, 10,000 people. So that's the type of impact. Okay. The two major developments that I've seen in the last 20 years have been, I mean, there's some very important historical developments, but just in the last 20 years, the emergence of poverty reduction strategies have really changed the conversation around how we respond to poverty and increased awareness about the need for measuring it and monitoring it, and also for thinking about poverty as a multifaceted thing, that it's not just like going to take one solution. It takes some sort of combination of solutions and some sort of coordination among that. That said, I don't think poverty reduction strategies have been all that effective, other than from a conversational level and in terms of moving the public understanding around poverty. There has been one good news story at that level, which has been the increase of the, I think it's called the Canadian Child Benefit. A few years back, the federal government started giving more money to families, basically households with children, based on the number of children that they have. Families have always received a bit of money, but they increased that quite substantially, or at least enough that it did have an impact. For a lot of people that were near the poverty line, at least measured in the way that we measure it, it did raise it a number of people above that line, and so the poverty rate did go down by a couple of percentage points. You know, that said, people that were well below the poverty line, benefited from having a bit more income, but it didn't necessarily do enough to raise them out of poverty. So it's mixed. I wonder, Aaron. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll go to another question that was asked, which is the question that I always get asked. But I just want to make sure that I give people a chance.
Why don't you continue on, Chuck? But yeah, people.
I think there's one for Sugandhi here that Sugandhi probably will more equipped to answer. How do we know for sure that people living with HIV all live in poverty, or a percentage of not living in core?
That is a good question.
I think it's a question about the geographic distribution of HIV.
Yeah, so this is, hi Colleen, it's a very good question, and there are two sorts of answers I can give, and both will be slightly unsatisfactory, but it's the best I can do. So where people get tested is where the numbers get reported. And so when we think about people are coming to the cities for the most part, right, for a lot of the HIV testing in smaller communities, maybe everyone knows each other and it's not as comfortable to get tested. And so the larger urban areas are always going to have higher numbers of HIV, both because of just the population located there, but also because of people traveling from smaller communities to the city to get tested. And then as well, from different community-based research projects and talking to people living with HIV, we have a sense of where people are living, what conditions they're living in, and overwhelmingly, people are living in low-income neighborhoods, are describing their own households as low income, talking about the basically different survival strategies they've employed, both for themselves, for their families, for their extended kinship networks. So I mean, we don't have like a 100% certain way of quantifying a question like, how do we know they're all living in the core? How do we know they're all living in poverty? We don't. The only thing I can really make this claim to, and I'm not even making the claim that it's everyone, just that based on the data that's available, right? Epidemiologically, we know where the testing results are reported. And then through community-based research projects and qualitative data collection, we know about the people's experiences that have been shared with us. I hope that kind of answers your question, but like I said, it's probably a little on the unsatisfactory side. I'm so self-deprecating, but I find it unsatisfactory. Maybe that's why I'm just projecting, because it's such a complicated issue.
I'll jump in on the next question, and it actually also relates to one of the questions that Aaron sent me beforehand. I'll talk to it, but I wonder, I suspect Sugandhi might be able to also speak to it a little bit as well. So the question that I already had from Aaron was basically, what about how does basic income figure into this, or universal basic income? And the question in the group here from Heather is, can someone comment on the effect of the pandemic on moving conversations forward around the UBI? So every time I talk about poverty, folks want to talk about basic income. And my response, or what I have to say about basic income, is evolving with these conversations that I'm having. To start, one of the reasons actually that I listed in my presentation, I didn't get into it due to time constraints, but one of the risks in defining an official poverty measure, especially using an income-based poverty measure, like the MBM, is that it risks making it sound like the problem of poverty is just income. And I think I really liked having Sigandi's talk after mine, because I think she really articulated in one of those areas around food security how income isn't the be all and end all. And so when I'm thinking about something like UBI, I think that generally social assistance rates are way too low. And I think that generally, if we provide people with more income than they're getting right now, they will be better off. That having been said, I do get concerned sometimes when people talk about basic income as a panacea, as though it will solve all the problems. I'm also concerned when people think that I am also concerned that sometimes people seem to think that UBI would be cheaper than other options, such as just providing services that people need. And I think that Sigandi actually provided a fantastic example of this in her presentation. So I'm gonna use it. And I'm always trying to come up with examples to illustrate this in really tangible ways. And this is like one of the most concrete ones I've got. When Sigandi was talking about the lack of a grocery store in downtown Saskatoon, the implied argument around providing something like a UBI and not thinking about just giving people income and not providing services, it sort of implies that what we need to do is give people enough income that they can get up and move to other neighborhoods. They can afford to move to neighborhoods that are closer to grocery stores. And for obvious reasons, that would be incredibly expensive. It would be much more expensive than just creating a damn grocery store in downtown and subsidizing it. Okay, so it's just an example of where the service solution is probably less than $1 million a year, probably much, much less than $1 million a year. The UBI solution would be astronomical. And so anyways, all of which is to say, people need more money, social assistance rates should be higher. I don't want us to stop it thinking about these problems just in terms of income. Sigandi, do you have anything to add to that around UBI and maybe the intersection between income and health? Unmute.
Yep, sorry, it's a 2020 proverb. You're on mute. No, I think you summarized it really well. Like it's about the interconnection that money alone won't solve the issue because there are all these other structural challenges. Full disclosure, I sincerely believe we need to blow up capitalism. That is a big part, like just that structure, right? We're throwing little band-aid solutions at it because it's the best we can do within the structure we exist in. Communist rant aside, it's about more than just giving people money, although it's such an important component of it, right? So for example, when the Shop Easy closed downtown, that was the one in City Park, I remember attending like a town hall that had happened, and someone from the community spoke, and she was receiving disability insurance, and that she would have to move now because the amount of money she received every month was dependent on her living within a certain radius from a grocery store. And so now not only was she disadvantaged because there was no grocery store in her area, she also now had to move in order to keep receiving these disability benefits. Benefits is such a misleading term. So I think I have a tendency to ramble, so I will end my comment there in that summary. It's a lot more than just money. There are structural issues to keep in mind.
There's one really technical question, which was just, they asked me to, I actually forgot there was a second part to Heather's question about money and COVID that I should have mentioned. But just on the technical question about what kinds of things go into the other category. So I mentioned that the new other category for the update is going to include being able to afford a cell phone. In 2008, when they rebased, one of the items was to be able to afford an internet connection. When they first based the first version of the NBM back in 2000, basically internet and cell phones weren't really a thing in the same way that they are now. There's kind of a rule of thumb for determining that. It's basically any consumption or service that 80% or more of Canadians don't need access, but just access. Once the rule of thumb is that if more than 80% of Canadians are consuming something, then it probably is something that everybody needs to have in order to not be poor. But a lot of other things, I've got a list. I won't share it because WebEx, but furniture, rugs and mats, curtains, sewing machines. There's a little bit around home entertainment, some basic, being able to afford some basic toys for children, sports, athletic equipment, household cleaning supplies. It's quite and I should mention that the calculation is fairly complicated. It's not that you have to be able to afford to buy all of those things in any given month. There's some math that's involved, but the spirit of the indicator or the basket is meant to try to capture that. I guess the only thing I would actually add about the COVID-19 piece and the UBI, and just to finish a response to your question, Heather, is I actually think that COVID-19, because it's changing the way that because it's really undermining sort of like the ordinary functioning of the market, or the economy, or the capitalist economy that Sagani was talking about, increase your services that no amount of money can buy, because those services aren't being provided. And so it's really forcing us to think about, what are we actually doing, not just what can we afford. Okay, so anyways, so I think that the pandemic is, I think, driving this point home, that poverty isn't just about income. I'm also very concerned, but obviously if people have less income, we're gonna have more poverty, and there's a lot of reason to think that that's to come as well. There's a question about, do you know how many older people live in poverty? Elderly poverty in Canada is really interesting. We actually have very low elderly poverty, relatively speaking, compared to other countries. And actually, our elderly population in Canada is less likely to be poor than our non-elderly population. And that actually has to do with a series of very deliberate decisions that were made in the 1970s to greatly increase the amount of income that we provide elderly citizens. We essentially have something like a UBI for elderly populations. And it's quite effective. It's been very effective. That doesn't mean that we do have, I think, we do have quite a bit of elderly poverty. It's still an important number. I think it's around 4 or 5% of elderly. But compared to the overall poverty rate of 12 to 13%, it's comparatively low. Yeah, that's kind of my answer to the how many elderly people live in poverty. Poverty functions differently. The way we think about poverty among elderly populations is a little different too, because it's not expected to be supplemented by labor income. So, are there any other questions? We're coming up on we're at 55 now. I wonder if Aaron wants to jump in and kind of wrap us up.
Yeah, is there any last questions? And if not, then yeah, I definitely can.
Marcy's kind of got an interesting question, whether or not the poverty reduction strategies adequately consider, identify, or address poverty among children and youth on their own. And this actually relates to a point that I was making earlier. Like, the poverty measure is really designed to accurately capture poverty in that modal family of 4 that I had on that slide before, and sort of capture poverty in every other kind of family. And so, a youth living alone, if they're 17 and they have their own apartment, let's say through some way through the social system, there's no special poverty line for them. It's just going to be the poverty line for a 1-person family. And there's when we did the workshop, we identified a lot of different types of living arrangements, or categories of people that need more support, need more access to various services and things that are non-discretionary, that would seriously make us rethink how we would want to apply the market basket measure to them. on a case-by-case basis. So an obvious example might be somebody with some sort of illness that requires them to spend a lot of money on medication. That right now doesn't really show up in the market basket measure. Another one is somebody who uses a wheelchair, and that affects how they're able to use transportation. That family of 4 was very able, it was assumed as very healthy, and doesn't suffer any sort of mobility issues. So there's a lot of assumptions built into that family. And it is adjusted with inflation, yeah. Go ahead, Aaron. So that was one last question about inflation. Yes, these numbers do actually take into account inflation, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. I think this is probably a good time to wrap up, although I know that there's lots of we could probably talk about this for a lot longer, and hopefully in the next couple of sessions we can kind of touch on some of the pieces that were brought up today. Just thank you so much, Chuck and Sugandhi, for sharing your knowledge and insights in this important topic. It was great to have you here, and thank you to Colleen for co-hosting this conversation series with us, and for the important work being done by the Saskatoon Poverty Reduction Partnership and all the organizations, both Saskatoon and across the province, doing this work. And thank you all for joining us today and for participating in this discussion. We will be taking a bit of a break in the conversation series next week, but you can join us again on Friday, October the 30th. We're going to have a discussion on the digital divide and access to technology amid COVID-19. So further detailed registration information will be available on our website, so please stay tuned, and it would be great for you to join us. And if you have any specific topic ideas, as always, get in touch with us, and I'll leave our email in the chat. And just to reiterate, these conversations are really open to everyone to join, so please do share with your colleagues, students, friends, and networks. And thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again, Chuck, Sugandhi, Colleen, and enjoy the rest of your Friday, and take care of yourselves.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a pleasure.